All right, let's get right into it. We're going to try and untangle one of the most charged words in politics today, populism. I mean, you hear this word everywhere, right? It gets thrown around to describe leaders, movements, you name it, all across the political spectrum. And, it almost always kicks off one of those super heated partisan debates that just goes absolutely nowhere.
So, what is populism really? I mean, is it an ideology? Is it just a political strategy? Or is it simply a dirty word people use? Well, that's what we're here to figure out. Think of this as a little investigation. We're going to dig into the latest research to finally get a real handle on this thing, and more importantly, why it matters so much right now. Okay, so every good investigation needs a starting point. Ours begins way back in the 19th century. This is where the whole idea really starts to take shape. Because, to get what populism is today, you really have to understand where it all started. So before populism could even exist, you needed this other big idea to come along first: popular sovereignty. And this was, truly a revolutionary concept. The idea that power doesn't come from a king or from a god, but it comes from the people. And this is the crucial part: the people can take that power back if the elites get corrupt or self-serving. This idea, it basically created the perfect fertile ground for populism to sprout. And boy, did it emerge. Our investigation points to three totally different places where this idea really took root. First, you've got Russia in the 1860s, the Nerdniki, these intellectuals trying to get the peasantry to rise up against the Tsar. Then, jump over to 1880s France. You got General Boulanger, this anti-establishment hero who's just railing against a corrupt parliament. And then finally, we land in the 1890s in the United States. The People's Party gets farmers organized against these super powerful banks and railroad companies. And this is actually where we get the word itself, populism. And here's what's so wild. Back then, calling yourself a populist was a total badge of honor. It meant you were on the side of the little guy, fighting for the common person. But today, it's almost always an insult, right? It's a label you slap on an opponent to discredit them. That is a massive, massive shift in meaning. All right, let's fast forward a bit. We're moving into the 20th century, and this is where things get really interesting. This is where populism doesn't just grow, it goes global, and it becomes this incredible political shapeshifter. There's a political scientist, Paul Taggart, who just nails it. He says populism has a chameleonic character. Think about that. It's not one fixed set of beliefs. It's more like a chameleon, changing its colors to blend in with whatever political environment it's in. It can attach itself to pretty much any ideology, left, right, you name it. And you can see this so clearly in Latin America back in the 40s and 50s. The whole region was dealing with all this economic hardship and crazy fast social change. And then, in step these really charismatic leaders, like Juan Perón in Argentina. They managed to build these massive, powerful movements by tapping into the frustrations of huge groups of people who felt totally excluded and left behind. And it's not just Latin America. Europe shows just how adaptable this thing is too. Take post-war France in the 1950s. You have this anti-tax movement that springs up called Pujadism, all about defending small shopkeepers against the establishment. And get this, one of its youngest rising stars was a guy named Jean-Marie Le Pen. Yep, the same guy who would later found the National Front and basically create the playbook for right-wing populism all over Europe. So, okay, we've got Russia, France, the US, Latin America. These are all wildly different places and times, right? But our investigation shows a really consistent pattern under the surface. All of these movements, they all tap into the same core ideas. This story of a pure, virtuous people who are being exploited by a corrupt elite. There's always a sense of crisis, that the nation is under threat, and there's always this super strong appeal to national pride. And that brings us right up to the modern era. As populism started showing up more and more as this really powerful force in politics, well, the case file on it just completely exploded. All of a sudden, academics just could not get enough of this topic. Which, of course, leads to the next big question. Why? Why the sudden boom in interest? What was it about the 1990s that made everybody and their brother suddenly want to study this thing? Well, the evidence is pretty stark. Just look at this chart of books published with populism in the title. For decades, it's basically a flat line, and then boom, starting in the 90s, it just skyrockets. This wasn't just a passing trend. This was a full-blown scholarly gold rush. So where were all these scholars looking? Well, it turns out the research was super concentrated in two main hotspots: Western Europe as the populist right was gaining steam, and Latin America, with its long, long history of populist leaders. And this regional focus, that's actually a really important clue for our investigation. And now we get to maybe the single biggest clue in this whole investigation. You'd think, right, with all this new attention, all these books and articles, we'd finally get a nice, clear definition of populism. Nope. We got the exact opposite. This chart here basically shows how scholars are approaching the concept, and, well, it reveals a field that is in complete and total disarray. Okay, get ready for this. The bottom line is that a staggering 57% of academic articles on populism either use a really unclear definition or they don't bother to define it at all. I mean, think about that. More than half of the experts writing about this can't even agree on what it is. So, yeah, no wonder the rest of us are confused. Okay, so after digging through all that evidence, what do we actually know for sure? Let's pull all these clues together and see if we can finally start to piece this puzzle together. So even though there's no one single definition, scholars do tend to agree on a few core ingredients. First, it's a worldview that splits society neatly into two teams, the good, ordinary people on one side and the evil, corrupt elites on the other. Second, there's that chameleon thing again. It doesn't have its own set of beliefs, it just attaches itself to an existing ideology. Third, it absolutely thrives in a crisis, especially when people feel like the whole political system has let them down. And finally, there's always this talk of a heartland or a silent majority, some pure, authentic version of the nation that's been lost and needs to be brought back. And you know what? Maybe that's the real takeaway here. Maybe the point of all this isn't to find some perfect, tidy dictionary definition. Maybe the goal is to understand why this word is so messy in the first place, why it's so powerful, and why it's so constantly fought over. Because that's where the real insight is. There's a great quote from the philosopher Stefan Rumens that I think just gets to the heart of it. He says, "Populism is in every case a symptom of a political problem, but not itself a solution." Think of it like a fever. A fever is a dead clear signal that something is wrong with the body, right? It's a symptom of a deeper sickness. But the fever itself isn't the cure. So when you strip it all down, populism isn't just an insult to be thrown around. It's more like a mirror. And what it reflects back at us is this fundamental, maybe even permanent tension that's at the very heart of democracy itself, that constant struggle between the people and the powerful.
And that leaves us with one last, really big question to think about. If populism is a symptom, if it's a warning light flashing on the dashboard of our democracy, then what is its rise telling us about our politics right now? What is the problem that it's demanding we pay attention to?